So welcome to this new video where we are going to talk about the structure of a thesis. That's something that students ask me, like the students I supervise, like, what is the structure I should follow? Because if I read a thesis, every thesis is a bit different, and that's totally true. Every thesis is a bit different. Sometimes you need more chapters, less chapters. Maybe you need more sections, less sections. There is not like a single recipe. So what I will try to do in here is to, based on the rubric, I think this is like the skeleton of the minimum that you have to have. So it's not that you should follow this blindly. You have to be very conscious of what you want to add and what you don't want to add, or if there is something extra that I didn't mention in here. So it is something very specific and individual for every thesis. But I think that this is a skeleton that might fit most of the thesis. And I hate being normative, but I end up being normative. I'm an accountant, so maybe I shouldn't have studied accounting and worse doing research because it's very normative. But my suggestion is try to follow this, but be conscious about your choices. Like, don't follow it blindly. And maybe this is the structure that you can follow at the beginning, and then you will realize if you need more or you need less. I don't know. And always keep in mind your supervisor, because also supervisors have different styles. I will say this is kind of my style. But let's take a look. So I think if you go back to the lectures, especially the problematization lecture, you'll remember this about the introduction. I showed you that. That the introduction generally has at least 4 sections. The first chapter, very important chapter because it's the face of your whole thesis. And in these sections, we divide them by, it's basically background, research problem, and then purpose and research question. That's the basic. You can have a few more things, like for example, a glossary of words that you will use, or maybe you can also add, I don't know, something that is important, like I don't know, I can think about anything else at the moment, but you can add more. But I think you should have at least these 3 sections, and let me explain why. First, you need the background. You need that background when you highlight the importance of your topic from a kind of big picture. Like, why is this important? I will say empirically important. So you can highlight, like if you're going to talk about sustainability, you can highlight some empirical data relevant to sustainability, like ESG, and then the environment aspects and social aspects, all of this practical stuff. And then you can say, like, if we study sustainability in this specific mechanism, like maybe strategy in this specific context, maybe a developing country where we don't have enough finance and we have like a dilemma of survive or be sustainable, then is it really a dilemma? You know what I mean? That's when you bring up the importance of your topic from a kind of practical point of view. And here I suggest that you don't need many references, especially academic references. You can use a few, but maybe will use more like practical references, like data or something like that. And then the second part is also very important. That's when you have to highlight the research problem. And this second section is basically, if you think about it, is basically answering to this question. Why should I read your thesis and not a book on that topic? So why should I read your thesis instead of reading a general book about strategy, sustainable strategy? Why will I learn from your thesis that I don't have in that book? That's basically the research problem. So in the research problem, you have to discuss that. Like, we know this and that and blah, 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 but we don't really know this. That is why we have to study there. So for that, you need a lot of references. You need a lot of research. You need a lot of books that show that we know that, but we don't really know that. It's kind of like a condensed literature review at some point, but highlighting a research problem. And then in 1.3 is kind of what you will do. The purpose is, what do you want to achieve? I want to study this, and we're going to do it like this. So you're kind of highlighting what will happen. It's like the synopsis of your thesis. And then you state your research question or questions. That's usually how we finish. Again, this is a matter of style, because other supervisors sometimes like to have the research question at the end of the literature review. It's okay, but I think it should be something like this, these 3 aspects. Then we move to the literature review. And also, I don't want to spend a lot of time here because we already discussed in the literature review lecture that we have at least these sections. The first and the last are kind of short because the first section is about the method of the literature review, how you did the literature review. We spent like half a lecture on that you have a systematic approach where you do a search and you need to show your keywords and where you search, the time frame, the language, the search, all of these things, and you have to justify all of your choices. Like we use these keywords because of this, we use this search engine because of this, we use this quality standard because of this, all those elements. And then you also report on the non-systematic review, like maybe something that your supervisor gave you, maybe some papers from previous courses, and then you need to show how it evolves. So you have an initial sample, and then you have more or less, whatever. All of this has to be reported in there. Usually it's like 2 or 3 pages, but it's very important. In the end, it's all about transparency and justification. Then 2.2 is the main body, the actual literature review, when you actually review the literature and you report what you see. In here, you learn that maybe you will find some themes that you want to show in there, like maybe you find like a dominant theory that you want to show. All of these things will come in here. Of course, this main body is difficult to give you a structure of that section because it differs a lot. Like sometimes you remember, right? Like you have maybe like a combination of 2 big theories, and then you want to position your research maybe somewhere in a combination, or you have this pyramid, inverted pyramid, where you start from broad and then you move to more specific topic. And usually you finish in this last section where if you are doing quant, you state your hypothesis. So you kind of wrap up the theory to state your hypothesis. So my hypothesis is that this will happen, and then you state your hypothesis. There is a positive relationship between this and that, this variable and the other variable. Or if you're doing qual, or you can do it also in quant, you can show your research model like this, the process of implementing a sustainability strategy in this context is involves a process that looks like this: financing, power, whatever it is that you found. So don't forget to highlight that research model and the hypothesis in your literature review. And then we move to the methodology, where it's going to be a very long section because it's a thesis. In a thesis, we want you to show a lot about the methodology. And keep this in mind. You have to be transparent to show what you did, but also to justify your choices, why you did it like that. In your thesis, you actually do have the freedom to decide whatever you want to do. So you have to show that you chose the best option that you had. So keep in mind these 2 aspects, especially for this chapter. What you did, so transparency, and justification, why you did it, these 2 things. And more or less, the chapter should look like this. Again, every thesis can be different, but more or less this. You talk about research philosophy and research approach in the first sections. You can do it in one if it's possible, but talk about all of this. What is what you are studying? Is it something objective or subjective? What type of knowledge are you trying to create? Something very objective or something that is constructed socially, or something that is positivistic or socially constructed? What is the methodology connected in that, and what is the approach and how everything is coherent? So maybe it's like a page or 2 pages on that. Then we go to more kind of operationalization of your research, the methods of data collection and the methods of data analysis. Since you already discussed the methodology, you can again talk about my method. Remember, methodology is the whole strategy that you will do. So for example, a case study, that's methodology, because the case study involves everything: the planning, the collection, the analysis, the conclusion. That's the case study, everything. Or an experimental study, that's also methodology, because it's the whole strategy: the sampling, and then the testing and the analysis. That's the whole strategy. So maybe you can highlight the methodology in some point in here, maybe in between, you add a new section to methodology and you talk about case study or whatever, but you have to discuss in detail the methods first of your data collection and then the data analysis. So maybe if you're doing a case study, you have different methods of data collection, like interviews, maybe observation, visits, collecting secondary data. These are methods of data collection. So you had to show, remember, first what you did, transparency, and second, why you did it like that. So you report what you did. Usually we use a table with these many interviews, and you write what you did. And we use interviews because of this, because blah, 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 and this other research also did it like this, it's similar topic, so we are studying something subjective, that's why interviews. All of that has to be in there. And then the method of data analysis. In this course, you learn thematic analysis, but remember, there are different methods in qual and quant. You have the content analysis, you have narrative analysis, you have the regression analysis if it is quant, you have a lot of different methods. You learn a couple in this course, but you have many, and you have to justify why that and how you did that. Then these other 4 sections, again, it's optional, you can have more or less, but sometimes it's a good idea to show this section on choice of theory, where you explain how is everything connected basically between the chapter 2 and chapter 3. Why these methods from here, method, data collection and analysis, and maybe this, links with this, with what you found in the literature, like why your theories fit with your methods. It's not mandatory, but sometimes it's nice. It doesn't have to be that much. It can be 1 or 2 paragraphs. It's okay. Then something that you do have to add is trustworthiness, this 3.6, this, where you talk about the validity and reliability and other aspects of your data and your whole study. So why is your data valid? Why is your sample valid for that population if you're doing quant? Why is this story valid for your phenomenon if you're doing qual? All of these things, you had a lecture on this, you have to explain that. It's usually a bit long, this section. Then ethical considerations, something very important. Everything related to ethical aspects, like what about the consent? Where did you store the data? Are the participants feeling safe? All of these things about ethics. And finally, a methodological reflection. It can be just something, again, this is not mandatory, but maybe you can highlight like a challenge that you face and how you solve it. So more or less, this is kind of the skeleton for the methodology chapter. And then we move to the findings, and I wrote in their analysis because I like to put them together. Sometimes supervisors like to separate, like first you show only the findings, very, very transparent, very vanilla, and then you have another chapter about analysis. But I think it, in my opinion, it's better to put it together, and I will explain why. Because either you do quant or qual, the idea is that you present your findings in an analytical way, not only like, these are my findings, bloop, and then it's just a lot of data in there. I think that can be a bit complicated. It's better and more useful, strategically smart if you present your data in an analytical way, if you present your findings. So I will start with how it looks like in quantitative research, what you should not miss. Usually we have at least these sections, usually at least the first 3. First, you start with descriptive statistics like mean, minimum, maximum, all of this, blah, blah, blah. And besides presenting the descriptive statistics, you also discuss a little bit what's interesting. What, from all of this, is it normal or not, or why? So you discuss all of these things. Similar to the correlation matrix, you show the correlations between your variables, and then you discuss, is this something positive, something negative, something surprising, or whatever. And then the regression model is the regression analysis. This statistical part is the most important because it's when you test your hypothesis. So you show your table and then you explain if it's significant or not, and then you support or reject your hypothesis. And sometimes you also have another section about robustness tests when maybe you were able to test the variable in different ways, and then you do different models. Like one model you tested like this, in another model you tested like that, and then you show if you have consistency. So that's more or less the skeleton for quant. And for qual is much more complex because in qual, the structure is more flexible. You have more freedom. In here, as you can see, it's very normative again. But in qual, it's very flexible. If you're doing a single case study, something you can do is to use the model that you finish in here, this research model with the elements, and then you report your case based on those elements. So for this company that I studied, they did the financing like this, and then you write a story on that. Then they deal about power like this. If you're doing a comparative case study, something that you can do is to follow the same thing like I say in here, like for this company, they solved the financing, and for this, they solved power blah, 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 and then you compare in between, or you can do two cases. First, case one, they did it like this, case two, they did it like this, like that, and maybe then you do some kind of wrap-up, similarities and differences. In general, something that I suggest is that when you are writing qualitative, you have to own the narrative. Like sometimes I see mistakes of students, or it's kind of problematic when you only report quotes. Like this person said this, I asked this, and the other person said that. I asked this, and then they replied this. That's not right for a case study reported to show your findings. You have to own the narrative. You have to write like a story, like they did this, and then they faced this issue and they solved it like this, but it was not that easy because this popped up, but when this popped up, they did this, like a story, not only like I asked this and they say this. Own the narrative. That's my suggestion. Then we move to the discussion. The discussion is different to the findings and analysis because in the discussion, as the name says, is when you are discussing with the literature. In here, in chapter 4, you don't really have many references. You can have a very, very few, but it's basically you are showing what you found. And in here, you do have to include contributions because it's when you discuss with the theory, when you say like, I'm talking with that paper. I want to have a conversation with that paper because I found something interesting that paper can be interested on. So the structure is generally a bit different to the findings and analysis. Usually we try to highlight what we call our contributions, and a contribution is something that you kind of that you found that it works like from the theory or that you contradict. So I will give you the basic formula for a theoretical discussion, for that theoretical conversation. And it is basically like this, 3 steps. First, you present the assumptions from previous literature. So you say, according to this topic, according to how power influences the sustainability strategy in this specific context, we learned that this was important, that maybe it was formal forms of power that were important. This is what we knew from previous research. Step 2, you show if you challenge or if you support those assumptions. So then you can challenge and then you can say, what we found in our case was not like that. What we found was that the informal mechanisms of power were more important than the formals. You're kind of challenging the previous literature. That's why it's a discussion. And then, of course, step 3 is why that happens. Usually, you borrow ideas from other research, and then you can claim, like, this research ignored the fact that in developing economies, people put a lot of attention to informal mechanisms and not the formal. So that's why in this context, it doesn't work like we thought it would work. It works differently because of this cultural element, maybe. So you see, you have a lot of references, especially at the beginning and at the end. And this is the discussion. So it's difficult, it's tricky. You need to know the literature and you need to know your data to kind of have discussion. And finally, the conclusion. I usually suggest a very long and very rich conclusion where you have at least these sections. First, a summary. Quickly wrap up what you did. Can be 1 paragraph or 2, but basically just summarize. Then theoretical contribution is again a summary of all of this. So you will say this is contribute to a better understanding of how informal and formal mechanisms of power affect a sustainability strategy development in this context. And you summarize like that your theoretical contributions. Then 3, sometimes you have a methodological contribution, especially if you use a very unique method. Like some students last semester used a method called visual accounting, which is quite new. So they had some suggestions for visual accounting method. Like they say, this concept was difficult and we solved it like this. It's again, I don't think it's necessarily or mandatory, but it's a nice section that you can add. Practical contributions, that's very important. You have to show what can managers learn from your thesis, not only the theoretical contributions, that's the most important, but also somehow important practical contributions. What can a manager learn from this? Then you also have limitations, like maybe you did a case study of one company but you weren't able to, for example, do a longitudinal study. You only studied this company for a couple of months, and that's a limitation. So highlight that limitation and then link it to the next section, future research. What would you do differently with more resources? So maybe you would do a longitudinal study to highlight more if these formal and informal elements of power change over time. That can be an idea for future research. And finally, something new, this is very JU, that you need to highlight the societal and ethical impact. It's very similar to the contribution, the practical contribution, but at the macro level. What can society, what can policymakers learn from your thesis? So we try to show you these ideas on how to structure your thesis. And in the previous videos, we also learned about the other side of how to write. So hopefully you find this interesting, you find it useful, and remember, this is not religion, so you shouldn't follow blindly. You have to be conscious, and remember, always discuss with your supervisor.